The congressional hearing room hummed with tension as Representative Nancy Mace leaned forward toward her microphone, a dismissive smile playing at the corners of her mouth. For the past 15 minutes, Representative Jasmine Crockett had been methodically presenting evidence about election security measures, citing specific data that contradicted several of Mace's earlier claims about voter identification requirements. "Representative Crockett," Mace said, her voice carrying throughout the chamber, "I find it entertaining that someone who's been in Congress for barely a year thinks she understands election security better than those of us who've actually implemented these systems at the state level. Perhaps in Texas they do things differently, but in the real world, these concerns you're raising are frankly laughable." A ripple of uncomfortable murmurs spread through the gallery as Mace punctuated her statement with a theatrical laugh, gesturing dismissively at Crockett's carefully arranged documents. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Crockett. Committee members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the sudden escalation. For 3 full seconds, Crockett remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable as she studied her colleague from South Carolina. Then she reached for her microphone and delivered a response that caused veteran political correspondents to freeze mid-keystroke. "Representative Mace," she began, her voice measured yet cutting with precision. "Before entering Congress, I served as the chief election law attorney for Dallas County, overseeing security protocols for 800 polling locations and 2.6 million registered voters. I personally drafted and defended the very security measures you're attempting to describe. So while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I'd suggest that when discussing the real world of election security, you might want to verify your facts before questioning the expertise of those who've actually built these systems from the naders." Ground up. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mace's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid expression as committee members straightened in their seats, suddenly alert to the significance of what they were witnessing. Before diving into this remarkable confrontation between two of Congress's most formidable representatives, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss our latest political analysis. Representative Jasmine Crockett had built her reputation in Congress through methodical preparation and substantive expertise rather than partisan theatrics. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she had practiced election law for over a decade before entering politics. Her experience wasn't merely theoretical. She had overseen election security implementations across multiple jurisdictions, trained poll workers on verification procedures, and successfully defended security protocols against legal challenges from both sides of the political spectrum. Before joining Congress, Crockett had served as the Election Security Counsel for Dallas County, where she led the implementation of the nation's first hybrid paper-digital ballot tracking system. This pioneering work had earned recognition from election security experts across the political spectrum, with the Nonpartisan Election Assistance Commission adopting several of her protocols as national best practices. "Election security isn't about partisan advantage," she had explained during her first campaign. "It's about ensuring that every legitimate vote counts while maintaining public confidence in the results. Both are essential to a functioning democracy." At 42, Crockett maintained the precise attention to detail that had characterized her legal career, approaching congressional hearings with exhaustive preparation and a command of both legal principles and practical implementation. While some colleagues relied on generalities and talking points, Crockett consistently grounded her positions in specific data and documented experience. Representative Nancy Mace had forged a different but equally distinctive path to Congress. The first woman to graduate from the Citadel's Corps of Cadets, Mace had established herself as a formidable voice for conservative principles and government accountability. After serving in the South Carolina State House, she had won election to Congress by positioning herself as a pragmatic problem solver focused on results rather than ideology. Mace's interest in election security stemmed from her time in state government, where she had supported legislation requiring voter identification and enhanced ballot chain of custody procedures. A skilled communicator with a knack for memorable soundbites, she had become one of her party's leading voices on election integrity issues, regularly appearing on national news programs to discuss the topic. "Free and fair elections are the foundation of our republic," Mace had stated in a recent interview. "Every American deserves absolute confidence that their vote counts and isn't diluted by fraud or mismanagement." The specific hearing that brought Crockett and Mace into direct conflict focused on H.R. 4217, the Election Security Enhancement Act. The legislation proposed federal standards for voter verification, ballot processing, and results certification areas traditionally left to state discretion. The bill had divided Congress largely along party lines, with supporters arguing it would establish crucial minimum standards and critics contending it represented federal overreach into state authority. As the hearing began, few anticipated the dramatic confrontation that would unfold. Both representatives were known as serious legislators who generally avoided personal attacks in favor of substantive debate. But beneath their professional demeanors lay fundamentally different perspectives on election administration, differences that would soon erupt into one of the most memorable exchanges in recent congressional history. Chairman Davis called the House Administration Committee to order at 10 a.m. sharp. Today's hearing will examine H.R. 4217, the Election Security Enhancement Act. We'll begin with opening statements from our colleagues. Representative Mace delivered her opening statement with characteristic directness, emphasizing state sovereignty and practical implementation concerns. This legislation represents a fundamental misunderstanding of election administration, she argued. States have successfully managed elections for 200 years. The federal standards proposed in this bill would create unnecessary complications while undermining local control. She cited her experience in South Carolina's legislature. When we implemented voter ID requirements, we saw increased voter confidence without decreased participation. The dire predictions of suppression simply didn't materialize. This bill ignores that practical reality in favor of federalizing a system that doesn't need fixing. When her turn came, Representative Crockett approached the topic differently. Rather than broad assertions, she focused on specific data points and documented case studies. As someone who has implemented election security measures across multiple jurisdictions, she began, I can confirm that while states rightfully maintain primary authority over elections, inconsistent security standards create vulnerabilities that affect us all. It displayed a series of charts showing security protocol variations across states. These disparities aren't just administrative differences, they represent genuine security vulnerabilities. When one jurisdiction uses outdated systems or inadequate verification protocols, it potentially compromises confidence in our entire electoral system. Crockett then methodically addressed several assertions that Mace had made in her opening statement. Representative Mace suggested that voter identification requirements haven't affected participation. The empirical evidence indicates a more complex reality. She displayed research from the University of Pennsylvania showing that certain ID requirements had measurably reduced participation among specific demographic groups in several states. This isn't partisan interpretation, it's documented data, Crockett noted. And it's precisely why this legislation establishes minimum security standards while preserving state flexibility in implementation. The bill doesn't federalize elections. It ensures that baseline security practices exist across all jurisdictions. As questioning began, the exchange between Mace and Crockett became increasingly pointed. When Crockett cited specific provisions of the bill that preserved state authority, Mace interrupted with visible frustration. Representative Crockett, these safeguards you're describing are window dressing on a federal takeover, Mace asserted. States don't need Washington bureaucrats telling them how to run elections that they've managed successfully for generations. Crockett maintained her composed, evidence-based approach. With respect, Representative Mace, election administration has evolved substantially in recent decades. Modern threats from cybersecurity vulnerabilities to sophisticated fraud attempts require coordinated responses. The bill simply ensures minimum security standards while preserving state implementation authority. The tension escalated when discussion turned to ballot chain of custody procedures. Mace described South Carolina's system as a model of security and efficiency, suggesting that federal standards would unnecessarily complicate proven state processes. In South Carolina, we've implemented strict chain of custody protocols that maintain ballot security without creating barriers to participation, Mace stated confidently. Our system requires dual verification at every transfer point, with Republican and Democratic observers documenting each step. This eliminates virtually any opportunity for tampering. Crockett listened carefully before responding. I appreciate Representative Mace's description of South Carolina's procedures. However, I've reviewed your state's official election security protocols as part of my preparation for this hearing, and they differ significantly from what you've described. She displayed an official document on the screen. South Carolina's actual procedures require verification at collection and counting stages, but not at intermediate transfer points. This creates a security vulnerability that election security experts have identified as significant. It's precisely this type of inconsistency that minimum federal standards would address. Mace appeared momentarily taken aback by Crockett's detailed knowledge of her state's procedures. Those documents don't reflect recent updates to our protocols, she countered. Without missing a beat, Crockett displayed another document. This is South Carolina's most recent election procedures manual, dated 3 months ago. It contains the same gap in chain of custody verification that I just described. The exchange had shifted from general policy disagreement to specific factual discrepancies, with Crockett methodically contradicting Mace's assertions through documented evidence. The mood in the hearing room tensed as committee members recognized the unusual nature of the confrontation, not partisan talking points, but a substantive challenge to factual claims. Mace, visibly frustrated by Crockett's command of specific details about South Carolina's election procedures, attempted to shift the discussion back to broader principles. The larger point remains states should determine their own election procedures without federal interference. I agree that states should maintain primary authority, Crockett responded. But that authority isn't absolute, when election security vulnerabilities in one state can affect confidence in our entire democratic system. This legislation simply establishes minimum security standards based on documented best practices, many of which come from innovative state approaches. As the hearing continued, Mace grew increasingly frustrated with Crockett's ability to counter broad assertions with specific data points and documented examples. The dynamic shifted from a typical partisan debate to what one observer later described as a confrontation between general talking points and specific expertise. The decisive moment came when discussion turned to voter identification requirements. Mace had been a vocal advocate for strict photo ID laws, frequently citing their role in preventing fraud. States like South Carolina have proven that photo ID requirements prevent fraud without suppressing legitimate votes, she stated emphatically. The concerns about suppression are theoretical, while the security benefits are real, Crockett responded with characteristic precision. Actually, Representative Mace, we have extensive empirical data on both questions. A 2020 study documented exactly 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud nationwide over a 20-year period, the only type of fraud that strict ID laws prevent. Meanwhile, research from MIT identified approximately 280,000 registered voters who were unable to vote in states with strict photo ID requirements because they lacked acceptable identification. She displayed these statistics on screen. This isn't partisan interpretation, it's documented data from non-partisan academic sources, and it demonstrates why this legislation takes a nuanced approach, requiring identity verification while allowing multiple verification methods beyond just photo ID. This methodical dismantling of Mace's central argument, backed by specific data rather than general assertions, visibly frustrated the South Carolina representative. In what seasoned committee observers later described as a tactical error, Mace abandoned substantive debate in favor of questioning Crockett's expertise. "Representative Crockett," Mace said, her voice carrying throughout the chamber, "I find it entertaining that someone who's been in Congress for barely a year thinks she understands election security better than those of us who've actually implemented these systems at the state level. Perhaps in Texas they do things differently, but in the real world, these concerns you're raising are frankly laughable." She punctuated her statement with a theatrical laugh, gesturing dismissively at Crockett's documents. The personal attack, unusual in a policy hearing, created a palpable tension in the room. Several committee members exchanged uncomfortable glances, surprised by the sudden shift from substantive debate to personal dismissal. Crockett remained perfectly still for 3 seconds, her expression betraying nothing as she studied her colleague from South Carolina. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured yet precise. "Representative Mace," she began, "before entering Congress, I served as the chief election law attorney for Dallas County, overseeing security protocols for 800 polling locations and 2.6 million registered voters. I personally drafted and defended the very security measures you're attempting to describe, so while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I'd suggest that when discussing the real world of election security, you might want to verify your facts before questioning the expertise of those who've actually built these systems from the ground up." The response, delivered without raising her voice yet devastating in its precision, created a moment of absolute silence in the hearing room. Mace's expression froze, the dismissive smile vanishing instantly. Several committee members visibly reacted, some suppressing surprised expressions, others quickly reviewing their notes as if suddenly reassessing the dynamics of the hearing. Chairman Davis, recognizing the significance of the exchange, intervened smoothly. "I appreciate both representatives' perspectives on this important issue. Let's continue with questions from other members." But the dynamic of the hearing had fundamentally changed. What began as a routine policy debate had transformed into a defining moment that committee staffers would later describe as the day talking points met expertise and lost. As the hearing continued, the impact of the exchange between Crockett and Mace reverberated through the committee room in subtle but unmistakable ways. Committee members who had previously directed their questions primarily to Mace now increasingly sought Crockett's perspective on technical aspects of election security. Representative Johnson, a senior committee member, posed a question that reflected this shift. Representative Crockett, given your experience implementing these systems at the county level, could you elaborate on the practical challenges of balancing security protocols with voter access? We hear a lot of theoretical arguments, but I'm interested in your on-the-ground perspective. This question focused on practical implementation rather than abstract principles, played directly to Crockett's strengths. Her response demonstrated both technical expertise and real-world experience. Thank you, Representative Johnson. The practical reality is that every security measure involves trade-offs, she explained. When I implemented Dallas County's hybrid paper-digital verification system, we discovered that adding security layers initially increased processing time by approximately 12 minutes per 100 voters. This created potential for lines and voter frustration. She displayed a flowchart showing process modifications. Rather than sacrificing security or access, we redesigned the verification sequence. By parallelizing certain steps and training poll workers on optimal procedures, we reduced processing time to just 4 minutes per 100 voters while maintaining all security protocols. This detailed, solutions-oriented response, focusing on practical implementation rather than partisan talking points, visibly impressed committee members from both parties. Representative Gardner, a conservative known for his skepticism of federal election legislation, followed up with a question that would have been unthinkable before the confrontation. Representative Crockett, how would you respond to concerns that these federal standards might create one-size-fits-all requirements that don't accommodate local variations in election administration? The question offered Crockett an opportunity to address one of the central criticisms of the legislation, which she handled with characteristic precision. That's a legitimate concern, Representative Gardner. Based on my experience implementing security protocols across diverse communities, I can confirm that local variations matter significantly. That's why Section 203 of this bill establishes performance standards rather than prescriptive requirements. She displayed specific text from the legislation. The bill requires adequate chain of custody verification, but allows jurisdictions to determine the specific implementation methods that work for their communities. Similarly, it requires identity verification, but permits multiple verification methods beyond just photo ID. This nuanced response, acknowledging legitimate concerns while explaining specific provisions designed to address them further, established Crockett's command of both the legislation and practical implementation considerations. Throughout this portion of the hearing, Mace remained uncharacteristically subdued. The South Carolina representative, normally quick with responses and follow-up questions, appeared to be recalibrating her approach following the earlier exchange. When she did speak again, her tone had noticeably shifted from dismissive to more substantively engaged. Representative Crockett, Mace began, her tone now carefully neutral. You mentioned earlier that Dallas County implemented a hybrid paper-digital verification system. Could you elaborate on how that system addressed concerns about digital manipulation while maintaining efficiency? This question, focused on technical details rather than broad assertions, represented a tacit acknowledgement of Crockett's expertise. The shift wasn't lost on experienced committee observers, one of whom later described it as the congressional equivalent of changing tactics mid-battle after discovering your opponent is much better armed than you anticipated. Crockett answered with the same measured expertise she had demonstrated throughout. Certainly, Representative Mace. The hybrid system addressed digital vulnerability concerns through a process we called parallel verification. Each ballot generated both a machine count and a paper record with a unique QR identifier. The two systems operated independently but could be cross-referenced through secure, air-gapped verification protocols. She displayed a security diagram on screen. This approach provided 3 key benefits. First, it created redundancy that prevented single-point manipulation. Second, it allowed rapid tabulation while maintaining paper verification. Third, it enabled efficient auditing through statistical sampling of paper records against digital tallies. As Crockett explained these technical details, committee members listened with growing attention. The conversation had transformed from partisan positioning to substantive discussion of election security best practices, precisely the type of evidence-based policymaking that congressional hearings were designed to facilitate. But rarely achieved. Chairman Davis, recognizing the productive shift in the hearing's tone, extended questioning time beyond the scheduled conclusion. I believe the committee is benefiting from this detailed discussion of practical implementation considerations. As the extended session continued, an unexpected moment of consensus emerged. Representative Mace, addressing a provision regarding provisional ballot verification, offered what observers recognized as an olive branch. Representative Crockett, Section 312 regarding provisional ballot verification procedures seems unnecessarily restrictive. Based on your experience, would a modified approach that maintained the security standard while providing greater state flexibility be feasible? This question, suggesting a potential compromise rather than wholesale opposition, represented a significant shift from Mace's earlier stance. Crockett recognized the opening and responded constructively. That's an insightful observation, Representative Mace. Section 312 could indeed be modified to focus on the security outcome rather than specific procedural steps. Perhaps language requiring multi-factor verification with documented chain of custody rather than the current specific procedural requirements would maintain security standards while providing the flexibility you're suggesting. This exchange, focused on specific improvements rather than partisan positioning, created a moment of genuine legislative progress. Chairman Davis seized the opportunity. I appreciate both representatives' constructive approach to improving this legislation. Would you be willing to work together on amendment language addressing Section 312 before full committee markup? Both representatives agreed, creating a surprising moment of collaboration that committee veterans later described as the most productive outcome possible from what began as a confrontational exchange. As the hearing concluded, the transformation was complete. What began with Mace dismissively laughing at Crockett's concerns had evolved into a substantive discussion of specific legislative provisions, with both representatives agreeing to collaborate on improvements. The committee had witnessed not just a personal confrontation but a victory for evidence-based policymaking over partisan positioning. In her closing remarks, Crockett maintained the same measured, substance-focused approach that had defined her participation throughout. This legislation isn't perfect, and I welcome constructive suggestions for improvement. But its core purpose, establishing minimum security standards while respecting state implementation authority, addresses a genuine need in our electoral system. I look forward to working with colleagues from both parties to strengthen these provisions before final passage. As representatives gathered their materials after adjournment, several committee members approached Crockett to continue discussion of specific provisions. The deference they showed to her expertise, regardless of partisan affiliation, represented the most meaningful vindication of her approach to the hearing. For journalists covering the committee, the story had transformed from routine partisan disagreement to something far more substantive. A veteran political reporter was overheard telling a colleague, "That wasn't just a comeback, that was a master class in how expertise can transform policy debates when properly deployed." By evening, clips of the exchange between Representatives Crockett and Mace had spread widely across traditional and social media platforms. What caught viewers' attention, however, wasn't merely the personal confrontation but the substantive contrast between general assertions and specific expertise. The Washington Post's congressional correspondent captured this distinction in an analysis titled, "When Expertise Matters: The Crockett-Mace Exchange as Legislative Turning Point." The article noted that, beyond the personal drama, yesterday's hearing represented something increasingly rare in congressional proceedings. A debate where specific knowledge and documented experience prevailed over talking points and partisan positioning. Political analysts across the spectrum acknowledged the significance of the exchange, though they characterized it differently. Conservative commentator Michael Steele observed, Representative Mace made a tactical error by questioning Crockett's expertise in an area where Crockett clearly had superior practical experience. The lesson here isn't ideological but strategic. Know your opponent's background before challenging their credentials. Progressive analyst Jessica Bird offered a different perspective. What made Crockett's response so effective wasn't just her credentials but how she deployed them. She didn't engage in personal attacks or partisan rhetoric. She simply established her expertise and returned to substantive policy questions. That's a model for effective legislative engagement regardless of party. For Mace, the aftermath required careful navigation. Her initial response, a tweet stating that robust debate makes legislation stronger, was widely seen as an attempt to reframe the confrontation as routine committee business. This characterization gained little traction as more people watched the full exchange and recognized its exceptional nature. 3 days after the hearing, Mace demonstrated political acumen by taking a more direct approach. In an interview on Fox News, she acknowledged, "Representative Crockett clearly brought substantial expertise to this discussion. While we may disagree on federal versus state approaches, I respect her practical experience implementing these systems. That's why we're working together on amendments that maintain security standards while respecting state flexibility." This forthright acknowledgement, rather than attempted minimization, earned Mace praise for professionalism. A senior political correspondent noted, "In recognizing Crockett's expertise without abandoning her own position, Representative Mace has transformed what could have been an embarrassing moment into a demonstration of legislative maturity." For Crockett, the aftermath brought increased attention to her approach to legislative work. Profile pieces highlighted her background implementing election security systems and her commitment to evidence-based policymaking. The New York Times published an analysis titled "The Practitioner Legislator: Crockett's Expertise-Driven Approach to Congressional Work," noting that her background implementing the policies she now legislated represented an increasingly rare profile in Congress. In an interview on CBS's Face the Nation, Crockett maintained her focus on substance rather than personal vindication. When asked about the confrontation with Mace, she redirected, "What matters isn't personalities but policy outcomes. Representative Mace and I are now working together on amendments that will strengthen this legislation while addressing legitimate concerns about state flexibility." That constructive engagement is far more significant than any single exchange during a hearing. This response, prioritizing legislative progress over personal triumph, reinforced Crockett's reputation as a reb-den, substance-focused legislator more interested in effective policy than partisan advantage. The substantive impact extended beyond personal reputations. 2 weeks after the hearing, the House Administration Committee reconvened to mark up the Election Security Enhancement Act. The legislation had undergone significant revisions, including the Mace-Crockett Amendment addressing provisional ballot verification procedures. The amendment replaced prescriptive verification requirements with performance standards that maintained security objectives while providing states greater implementation flexibility. This approach, focusing on security outcomes rather than specific procedures, addressed one of the central criticisms of the original legislation while maintaining its core purpose. During markup, Chairman Davis acknowledged the amendment's significance. This bipartisan provision represents the kind of thoughtful compromise that improves legislation. Representatives Mace and Crockett have demonstrated how members with different perspectives can work together to address legitimate concerns while maintaining core objectives. The amended legislation passed committee with Mace and a matter of bipartisan support, a rare outcome for election-related bills in the current political environment. Several representatives specifically cited the Mace-Crockett Amendment as addressing concerns that had previously prevented them from supporting the bill. For election administration professionals, the legislative evolution represented something more significant than political maneuvering. The National Association of Election Directors issued a statement noting that the revised legislation demonstrates how practical implementation experience can inform better policy. The performance-based standards approach maintains necessary security baselines while respecting the practical realities of election administration across diverse jurisdictions. Perhaps most significantly, the Crockett-Mace exchange catalyzed a broader conversation about expertise in legislative processes. Editorial boards across the country published thoughtful analyses examining the role of practical experience in effective policymaking. Representative Crockett's background implementing the very systems she now legislates represents an increasingly rare profile in Congress, wrote a constitutional scholar in The Atlantic. As legislation addresses increasingly complex technical domains from election security to artificial intelligence regulation, the gap between theoretical understanding and practical implementation experience becomes increasingly consequential. 6 months after the confrontation, its impact continued to resonate. When the Election Security Enhancement Act reached the Senate, the Mace-Crockett Amendment was highlighted as a model provision during committee hearings. Senator Lankford, a conservative with significant election security expertise, specifically praised its balance between necessary federal standards and appropriate state implementation flexibility. The legislative approach pioneered in the amendment establishing performance standards rather than prescriptive requirements subsequently influenced other technology-related legislation. A major cybersecurity bill adopted similar language, requiring specific security outcomes while providing implementation flexibility for different industries and contexts. For those studying congressional dynamics, The Crockett-Mace confrontation and subsequent collaboration became a case study in effective legislative engagement. The Congressional Research Service published an analysis titled, "From Confrontation to Collaboration: The Crockett-Mace Model of Evidence-Based Legislative Development," documenting how the initial confrontation ultimately led to more effective legislation through substantive engagement rather than continued partisan positioning. 3 years later, when another major election security bill reached Congress, both Crockett and Mace were appointed to the conference committee reconciling House and Senate versions. Their joint work on that legislation, finding substantive compromises that maintained security standards while respecting implementation realities, demonstrated how their initial confrontation had evolved into a productive working relationship based on mutual respect for each other's expertise and perspective. For ordinary citizens, the confrontation and its aftermath offered a rare glimpse of how congressional oversight and legislation should ideally function. A civic education organization developed a teaching module based on the Crockett-Mace exchange and subsequent collaboration, using it to demonstrate how substantive expertise and willingness to engage across partisan lines could produce better policy outcomes. The lasting legacy of the confrontation wasn't personal victory or defeat, but a model of how expertise, properly deployed, could transform political confrontation into constructive engagement. In an era often dominated by partisan positioning, the Crockett-Mace exchange offered a glimpse of more substantive legislative development focused on effective policy rather than political advantage. As a senior congressional correspondent observed 3 years later, what began with a dismissive laugh ended with substantive legislation that actually improved election security while respecting state authority. That's not just a personal triumph for either representative, it's a victory for the legislative process itself when it functions as designed. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important legislative developments. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on the role of practical expertise in effective policymaking.